Hello. In this session, we're going to be looking at the British Reformation, some of the things that led up to it, major events during it, and some of the aftermath. So let's start with a few of the events from the late Middle Ages, which I think are important to understand because they put what happened in the 16th century into context. The first one I'd like to talk about is Thomas à Becket. Thomas was born to low-ranking Norman parents. He was born in Cheapside in London and was educated at Merton Priory and St Paul's Cathedral School. Probably they were low-ranking, but they still had some money. So they weren't major landholders, but they did have some land and some income, so they could afford to get him educated. Having been educated, he did a variety of jobs and in time became a lay servant to Theobald of Bec, who at that time was the Archbishop of Canterbury. Thomas was an able clerk, very good with his letters, and Theobald saw something in him, so he sent him to Paris to study canon law and then used him as his envoy, particularly in matters involving going to other parts of the church on the continent. As Thomas progressed, he needed an income more suited to his new standing, and so he was made Archdeacon of Canterbury and given several prebends of Lincoln Cathedral. These days, if you're Archdeacon of Canterbury, you're expected to actually do a decent amount of work in your archdeaconry. In those days, it was seen as just a way of taking a proportion of the income from each of the benefices in that area to fund him, and he might then occasionally visit those benefices. And certainly the prebends of Lincoln Cathedral, the manors that produced the money to support those prebends, well, it could all be directed to one person. So he had a pretty good income. Now, he was doing his job so well that Theodore suggested to Henry II that Thomas, who's now known as à Becket because Theodore was from Bec, so he's Thomas of the house of the person from Bec, Thomas à Becket, suggested to the king that he should be made Lord Chancellor. So in 1155, he was made so. And he proved himself very astute at getting money in from the nobles, but also from the church. At this point in history, the church has a significant amount of land. In a couple of centuries, when we're looking at the Reformation, we'll hear that a third of the land of the country changed hands at the Reformation as the monasteries were dissolved. And Thomas was astute at getting some of that money out of the church to help fund the king. So the king felt he was an ideal candidate when sadly Theobald of Bec died. He put Thomas forward and it was agreed by the church that he would be the next Archbishop of Canterbury. So he was priested on the 2nd of June 1162 and consecrated to be the Archbishop of Canterbury on the 3rd of June 1163. Henry was delighted he'd got his man in place. But as soon as he became Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas then committed to looking after the role of Archbishop of Canterbury. Now he was defending the rights of the church to retain its income rather than give it to the king. There were good reasons for defending these rights. The church was basically the welfare state. People came to those monasteries when they were starving, when they needed care. The church was providing education in the country. It needed the income to do its job. But Henry wasn't so happy. The other thing that Thomas sought to protect was the rights of clergy to be tried only in church courts, even if they committed quite serious crimes. Henry tried to get Thomas to acknowledge the traditional rights of the crown over the church. Becket refuses, and he's exiled to France, and he threatens to excommunicate the whole of England over this. The Pope gets involved, seeking a compromise, and Becket returns in 1170. On his return, fairly quickly, he discovers that 3 bishops have crowned Henry's son as heir apparent. But coronation is the privilege of the Archbishop of Canterbury, and so he excommunicates those 3 bishops. Henry expresses his frustration with Thomas, and you know what happened because of that. Thomas becomes a saint, and a cult develops. So that's just one of the challenges between king and church during the later Middle Ages. The next one I want to mention is King John. In 1205, the chapter of Canterbury Cathedral was split over who they wanted to elect as the next Archbishop of Canterbury. Now, even in those days, if the king had a candidate, he expected the chapter to elect that candidate. But instead of just rolling over to that, both parties appealed to the Pope, who instead imposed Stephen Langton. In fact, the Pope consecrated him as Archbishop of Canterbury. Stephen had studied at the University of Paris and lectured there on theology, and the Pope, Innocent III, had met him there and had formed a friendship. He then called him to Rome and made him a cardinal priest of San Crisogono, Rome. His piety and his learning had won him many prebends in Paris and York. That means people had given him the income from various places to keep him in a style he would like to be accustomed to. Pope Innocent III wanted him to be Archbishop of Canterbury, but King John was furious about this, and he expelled the Canterbury chapter, who by now had united behind Stephen Langton, since the Pope had decided that's who it should be. And King John declared as a public enemy anyone who backed Langton. Pope Innocent III placed England under an interdict. An interdict is a ecclesiastical order, which means that certain people or groups of people cannot be involved in the rites of the church. So, no weddings, funerals, baptisms, or masses in England, while the whole country is under interdict. That happened in 1208. By 1212, the Pope also declared that King John was now deposed as King of England and gave the King of France the job of executing John. King John finally gave in, and so Stephen returned to England in May 1213, and the interdict was lifted. But just think what it was like for England during those years. Bodies still had to be buried, but couldn't be buried in churchyards. Couples still wanted to be married, but couldn't be married in the sight of God. Babies not baptized. And priests locked in their homes, not being allowed to minister. I suspect some of them disobeyed the Pope and carried on ministering. The interdict was lifted. Stephen absolved John of what he'd done, but then was heavily involved in leading the barons and bishops who demanded that John sign the Magna Carta. The king might have certain rights in the country, but he was to be under the rule of the law. Another thing Stephen Langton did for us was the way our Bibles are divided into chapters. It's his work. From the next century, some what might seem at first sight fairly obscure statutes. They're the statutes of provisors and of praemunire. Popes in the 13th century had taken suspending the right of a patron to appoint to a benefice in England, so that they could appoint their own man, And that person wouldn't actually come to England to do any work, but they'd get the income from the benefice, from tithes, from glebe fields that had been given for the upkeep of the rector of the benefice. Edward I, in 1306, passed a law called the Statute of Provisors, which said no tax imposed by any religious persons should be sent out of the country, whether under the name of rent, tallage, tribute, or any kind of imposition. By Edward III's reign, 50 years later, a stronger statute of provisors was passed. That's in 1351, stating, "The Pope of Rome, accroaching to him the seigniories of possession and benefices of the Holy Church of the realm of England, doth give and grant the same benefices to aliens, which never did dwell in England, and to cardinals, which might not dwell here, and to others as well aliens as denizens, as if he had been patron or advowee of the said dignities and benefices, as he was not of right by the laws of England." So, stating in stronger terms, that basically the Pope was extracting money from England for no benefit to England. Edward insisted on the local appointment or election of people to offices according to the customs of this land. So that's the statutes of provisors. The statute of praemunire forbade appeals to foreign powers, including the Pope, with a penalty of losing all your goods and being imprisoned. And this was having first been put in Edward III's day, in 1353, was reinforced in 1393 under the reign of Richard II, when he said, "If any purchase or pursue or cause to be purchased or pursued in the court of Rome or elsewhere any such transactions, processes, and sentences of excommunications, bulls, instruments, or any other things whatsoever, he and his notaries, abettors, and counsellors," and then goes on to say that they'll be put out of the king's protection, their lands forfeited to the king. It wasn't that it was no longer legal to make such appeals, but if you did, it was going to be counted as treason. Yeah, go figure. So that's sitting in the background. Meanwhile, why, when we got to the 16th century, are people ready for something? Now, some people have seen the English Reformation as entirely imposed from above. It's the act of a state, particularly the king. The rulers said the church had to change, and so people accepted the change. But unless our forebears were very different from us today in this country, I very much doubt this explanation is the whole truth. I mean, yes, it was convenient to Henry to break with Rome, but subsequently changes in worship were accepted and embraced, even in many of the far-flung parts of the country. And in Ireland, it was never accepted by much of the population, even though Ireland was ruled by England until the 20th century. Also, some families, indeed some areas, actually successfully resisted becoming Protestant until Catholics were tolerated. We have the old Catholic families of Norfolk, for example. But most people, the vast majority, accepted the Reformation. So although the break with Rome was initiated by the king, it was received by the people. So why were the people happy for this break? Well, one reason is that they'd got fed up with abuses of the church. The chief one being church money making at the expense of the poor. This is the way the History Learning site puts it. The vast bulk of population were very angry at the way the Roman Catholic Church had used them as a source of money. To get married, you had to pay. To get a child baptized, which you needed to be if you were to go to heaven, so the Catholic Church preached, you had to pay. You even had to pay the church to bury someone on their land, which you had to do, as your soul could only go to heaven if you were buried on holy ground. Therefore, the Catholic Church was very wealthy, while many poor remained just that, poor. Their money was going to the Catholic Church. Therefore, there were no great protests throughout the land, as many felt that Henry would ease up on taking money from them. Henry knew of the Catholic Church's unpopularity and therefore used this to his advantage. As we've heard in previous centuries, there were aims to stop that money being taken out of the country. But even if it was taken but stayed within this country, but just made certain abbots and bishops very rich, it was still resented. Another problem was the immorality of the clergy. And so in Princes, Pastors and People, Doran and Durston say, as a result of the episcopal visitations in the Diocese of Lincoln during the period between 1515 and 1527, only 10% of the clergy were accused of immorality. Doran and Durston used this to argue that the state of affairs in the church was not as bad as has been made out by those who wrote the history of the times in the subsequent century. However, if my visitation showed 10% of the clergy being immoral, but maybe we can make some allowances for them. Brothels for the use of the clergy, such as were found in the London parish of St John Zachary, you can find details of that in P. Heath, the English parish church clergy on the eve of the Reformation, which was published in 1969, were rare. Usually immorality meant the clergy had a hearth companion to whom they were faithful. They would have married if they'd been allowed to. And the laity were relaxed about this difference between church law and local custom in many areas. Perhaps one of the biggest problems among the clergy was pluralism. Some clergy took the tithes from rich livings and then employed a poor, ill-educated assistant in their place, an assistant curate. So while the rich clergy had an income of maybe over £100 and did little for it, the clergy they employed had less than a fiver and worked hard for it. The lay people resented the clergy who were doing the work not getting the money for it. And some monasteries were in very good order and were really fulfilling that role of caring for the people. But others were very rich landowners who weren't always as generous to their tenants as they might have been. Their abbots had the rank of nobility and lived like it. And this irked both the common people and the nobility too. And a final complaint was the involvement of clergy in the affairs of the state. Clergy were educated and were often pulled into state posts. It meant they had less time for doing work for the church, but it also started to irk those who hadn't become clergy, particularly those who had studied law. They felt themselves perfectly able for doing these posts. So why are these clergy, who had a different law system, remember, doing what felt like their work? And of course, these clergy weren't being paid for doing this work. They were withdrawing money from the church and then employing assistant curates to do the work in the church. It had all got very distant. So by the time Henry VIII had his divorce problems, many were already calling for a reformation in the English church. And some, inspired by Luther's ideas, were looking to the king to enforce it on the church.